Well, as the dean said, this project started with a request actually from him to our former school environment and natural resources director that he wanted to know more about the physical woods, those acres, 600 plus acres that were here. And at the time, Ron Hendrick said, I have a group of people that's been doing kind of management plan stuff on a couple of the other OSU properties, Waterman Woods, Don Scott, and they can come take a look. Those little words got us started down this path of, once we started looking, we realized there was a lot here that we needed to learn, and there really hadn't been any comprehensive planning or any type of inventory that we knew bits and pieces. And so it was time to kind of lay that foundation, that groundwork. Last summer, there were 4 of us that spent pretty much 3 full to 4 full days kind of walking sections to try to get a feel for what was here. And then we had one of our student capstone courses in the Maymester here this year that started the data, and that's kind of what you're going to see is this preliminary report is the data that they pulled together in the 4 days that they were here collecting data, and then the reports that they put together the following week and then presented to several of us during that Maymester report. So in order to understand what we're looking at, we kind of had to step back and say, well, you know, where's the history of the place? This is a 1950 photo, and we're probably right in here somewhere. So when they built campus, they built it in the center of the woods. There was plenty of open ground. It's kind of interesting that, you know, they ended up placing the buildings in the wooded area. This is a 1960 photo, so you can kind of see that they've started the process. Campus started in '64, and so you've got definitely plenty of wooded acres, but a lot of open ground as well. There are some historic sites on campus that I was not aware of this. The students started, as they did their inventory, they found this site out along Lexington Spring Mill Road, and this was one of the first where they used laser technology. And these images, some of our folks dug up, were from 1968. You can see how this is laid out in order to measure these markers. There's some of the first technology that they had on the site. You can kind of see as they're setting up to use this new technology of lasers. Here's what it looks like today. You can kind of see the beginnings of it when you're out on Lexington Spring Mill, but you really can't see a whole lot of it until you come back into the Autumn Olive and some of the other things that are coming up around. But there's still, most of those sites are there, so it could easily be reopened and kind of re-accessed if you wanted to do that as the historical part of this plan. And there's one of the grad students that was here, and then the faculty member, which is Bob Gates, which is back here. So part of what we started looking at is, in any management plan, when you're looking at a resource, you need to look at all the components. And so one of those layers of data were the streams for the property. And it is pretty amazing when you start looking what kind of stream reaches we have going through this 640 acres. There's pretty much a stream for about every segment of acre ground that we're looking at. What the students then did is they tried to put this into habitat areas so they could better understand and kind of try to group things together that made sense to group together. In this map, kind of, you can see the buildings are all coded in one color. The wetlands and the vernal pools that were discovered are in these blue areas. Again, more buildings out here. You have old field areas. There's more down this way and out this way. This is where the historical laser site is. And then you have plantations. And so that was one of the things when we did our preliminary walk, we were kind of interested to find that there were some old plantations, and we did dig into some records to figure out when they were planted and what was planted. But there are some records that we still don't have about when and where. So one of the things that you have to understand is that every one of those dots is one of their data points. So you had 35 students that were here that spent 4 days out roaming all of this acreage, and these were their data points. There's obviously places that they probably could have hit, that we've missed some things, but this was, I thought, a pretty good overview of how they laid out their plots, and the information we got is a good start for what we need to know about what's here. So I said there were 35 students. They spent 6 days here. That's because they came up a couple of days, and some of us spent time with them here in the woods a couple of separate days. This is Marne Titchenell, one of our wildlife extension persons, and so out in the woods, talking about what they're seeing, what to look for. It's part of taking how they've learned things in the classroom, and now you walk out in the woods and what do you see? What does it tell you about the woods? And part of those historical photos then play into that. It's like, so you're standing here, 50 years ago it looked like what? What do you see today? And what kind of things are going on? So they separated the forest acres into 3 components. They called one the legacy, 128 acres. This was pretty much all of that wooded area. When we looked at those historical photos, that was here when the property was purchased. These young woodlands, in most of those historical photos, where it was open ground, a lot of it was pasture. There was some of it that was cropped. It was pretty much left to revert back to woods on its own. So it's very young forest, very typical of what you would find if you were walking through the woods and you knew it had a history of being grazed. Very typical of what you would see in almost any part of the state. And then the pine plantations. So you have 330 acres in this young forest, 128 here, and then there's about 29 acres that are planted pine plantations that were put on either as part of the Conservation Reserve Program or some other type of conservation program that were planted on the site. So let's look at some of these. We break down kind of that legacy forest. There's about 122 trees to the acre. Dominant species, sugar maple, red maple, white ash, and beech. In the regeneration, if we look at what's in the understory and what that next layer may be, there is some oak, there's some black cherry, yellow poplar, and sugar maple. And so you kind of get a sense for what they were seeing in those larger stands. And then you've got, in contrast, you have the young forest. A lot more trees to the acre. These were bigger trees, smaller trees, dominated by red maple, sugar maple, black cherry. All of these can be some of those early trees that we see when you start talking about some of these areas, especially the ash and the elm. Unfortunately, where ash and elm are high in population, we'll lose the elm to Dutch elm disease, and we'll probably lose the ash to emerald ash borer, as it is here on campus. And so some regeneration that we see is black cherry, red maple, sassafras, and elm again. The pine plantations are a little bit different, a lot more trees to the acre. A combination, one plantation is all white pine, there's another one that's mostly red pine. Most of them were planted through the Conservation Reserve Program. It's kind of interesting, the program itself, the paperwork that we found said 31.8 acres. I'm not certain that all of that got included because in some of those sections where pines were planted, hardwoods have taken over and there's almost no pine. You might find a tree occasionally. And so there's definitely different success rates across the plantation. And in those areas, you're definitely getting more of the yellow poplar and sugar maple. You're seeing that transition where they try to plant conifers, the hardwoods are starting to come in. These are just some shots of the students as they were out taking their inventory plots. So you can see where they were looking for invasive species, they were looking for wildlife habitat variables, looking at the forest structure, and collecting data that then went into a program that the Forest Service has created called SILVA, which collects all that data and kind of spits out some management recommendations or thoughts on what's going on in that process. So regeneration-wise, this is one of the tables that was created. You can kind of see by acres, black cherry seedlings, yellow poplar, some oak species. This other desirables We got a lot of species that are falling into that category. The kind of the next round of data collection, we need to dig a little deeper and figure out what else is sitting in some of these other categories. And then we can kind of see the same thing on the sapling side. Wildlife. I actually used this photo because as I came through one morning to collect some invasive species samples for a class, these guys were running around out by health sciences, and it was kind of interesting because Mom was ready to go into the woods. The little guys were not interested at all. So there's a lot of different habitats. So they looked at terrestrial, which is forest and field. They looked at the wetland and the vernal pools. So you've got mitigated wetlands just outside the building here, and you've got these vernal pool habitats that are pretty cool, spread throughout the wooded acres. So you can kind of see they started looking at, well, you know, what are we going to manage for? Are there endangered species that we need to look for? And Indiana bat was one that popped up. So this yellow circle is within the 5-mile radius of an Indiana bat capture, and it captures this corner of the campus. And this red dot is an eagle nest that has been identified. And so that's kind of those endangered mammals or wildlife that they were looking at to look at what kind of concerns did they need to worry about. The Indiana bat one, they have to figure out how much of this plays into the acreage that we're looking at, but it definitely overlaps the campus area. So the vernal pools, kind of a neat feature. A lot of landowners would love to have them. You've got some amazing ones here on campus. This is one of them. And so if you aren't familiar with vernal pools, they're one of these wetlands. They're dry for part of the year. They're wet in the spring in order to have salamanders and some of the other amphibious life to utilize this debris in the water. Aquatic macroinvertebrates, as I said, amphibian reproduction. And a couple of these are really, really unique. There's one that is very large, and all of them are unique in their own way. So those are habitats that we need to pay attention to, something that we need to protect and make certain that we preserve. Salamanders that were found in the one large vernal pool, and then Marne has an egg mass in her hand as she went diving into the water that morning into the larger vernal pool, which I think is here. So this is part of the larger one. You can kind of see the buttonbush swamp in the back. We did have a Canadian goose in the middle of the woods that had nested at the base of the tree. Kind of an odd spot for a Canadian goose to find its way and nest, but she had laid eggs right there at the base of the tree, and this is that edge of the vernal pool. When you look at the streams, overall the stream conditions were considered to be good as they went through and did their ratings. There is some sensitivity due to the surrounding land use, and so as we look, you've got some agricultural land that feeds into some of it. You've definitely got some construction, more development lands coming in, and so those are things that have to be paid attention to. But overall, at this point in time, they all come up as good. One fish that was found was this mottled sculpin, but they did find some other species. As you can see as they went through and did their surveys. Now they didn't survey every stretch, and they kind of picked some segments to look at, and so there's definitely more reaches that need to be taken a look at. You can kind of see here, they're measuring width, they're looking at different measurements as they work through the chemistry and the flow, what kind of substrate are they dealing with as they work through their data points. Invasive species. There's definitely plenty of invasive species here. But what I will say from the perspective of having dealt with invasive species and working with woodland owners across the state, it's still very manageable here. Your woodlands here are not inundated yet, and I say yet because it's a matter of time. Part of that plays right here. As emerald ash borer opens up the canopy of some of these stands, we will see the autumn olive and we'll see the honeysuckle and some of those others. They're kind of sitting out there on the edge of the woods. They will start to move their way in and really change the characteristic of the woodlands. And if you look in the background, the photo I have there is from here, and all of that lovely brown standing is garlic mustard. And to add to emerald ash borer, we were here doing a teacher workshop at the beginning of August, and as we were doing some training around Ovalwood Hall, a couple of us looked down and realized that you also now have the invasive insect viburnum leaf beetle that is starting to kill the viburnum at the edge of the woods. This is the farthest south and west the viburnum leaf beetle has found, and so we reported it to the Department of Agriculture, and we used our Invasive Species app to put a dot on the map so that we know where it is, and we're trying to track it across the state. So you have a list. I mean, that's quite an extensive list, but for the most part, it's still a manageable list. While there's a long list of titles there, populations are not as huge as they could be. And so there are some options when we talk about controlling. I will show you here, though, these are kind of the plots, the percentages that they were seeing. Buckthorn was one of those that there's some interesting things research-wise that are going on with buckthorn that we probably need to pay maybe a little bit more attention to. Same way with honeysuckle. There's some thoughts that there's some pathogens and some allelopathic issues when we start to do restoration work that we need to think about. If you want to remove it, there's a couple of things that we can look at. This is a lovely little thing that just attaches to a woody stem and gets attached to a tractor and yanks out. If you're going to do it on a larger scale, this is a piece of equipment that we actually have on the farm property of the Molly Cairn Ag Center at London, Ohio, where we do farm science review. This is a piece of equipment called Jaws that yanks the shrub out of the ground, which is a much quicker, more expensive, much quicker aspect of trying to get it out and try to get things under control. So that was kind of an overview of what they looked at, what they sampled, kind of some of the preliminary data that they got. And so then they were asked to sit down, and they met with the dean, and they met with Brian White, and they talked about what the goals were, what they saw, and then were asked to put some recommendations and suggestions and concerns together. So these are some of those recommendations and concerns. Retaining this old growth, there's behind the Child Development Center, there's some really nice older growth, part of that original forest that was here when the property was purchased, that they suggested that we really try to maintain and retain. Remove these invasive species, realizing that every time we open up something, we're opening up a corridor for more invasive species. And so we have to be cognizant that there's a seed source, and no matter what we do management-wise, we have to pay attention to this one. This is a game changer in some areas. Connecting the bike trails, that was one of those discussion points about how the bike trails traverse around Richland County and how can we connect with those bike trails to bring people into campus and utilize the area better. We talked about one of their suggestions, one of the groups had this passive signage that we could talk about, invasive species along the trails. Can we talk about the forest and what it's going through, what it's looking at, what kind of passive signage could we do as we encourage people to come in and use the trails on campus to educate them about what's here and the value of it. And then this was an interesting one that seems to have legs all of its own. The students were talking about Stone Lab up on Lake Erie, where you can kind of go and learn so much more about what's going on with Lake Erie and the recovery and a lot of the lake aspect of environment. They were talking about a terrestrial version of Stone Lab being based here. So that people could come and take classes, and whether those are teacher workshops, whether those are student classes, graduate classes, and in my case, maybe more extension-based classes for anybody that wants to attend, to come in and learn more, because you've got so vast of a resource, let's take advantage of it. Most of us have said it's really nice to have a classroom that's wired and has everything that you need, and then you just walk outside into the woods. And that's not very common across the state. And so just if you're not familiar, Stone Lab does have a website, and you kind of take a look at what's going on at Stone Lab. One of the interesting things is They actually offer a 2-day digital photography class with one of our wildlife faculty, and then they bring another instructor in. And we've already had conversations about hosting one of those or 2 of those here. And so there's some things that are moving. We'll see what happens with those, but so there's some opportunities, I think, if you look at the Stone Lab model and how you can replicate that and focus more on the terrestrial side of things. Some more of the recommendations and the concerns. Hold more workshops, and we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end here. We're going to talk more about what we're doing in extension. One of the things that was interesting is that when our first conversation started, the fact that campus was so wooded and isolated was a negative, and it really shouldn't be a negative. It should be a positive, because it is a unique campus, and it offers a unique opportunity for some folks. And so make that a positive and market it that way. This one is large for us in the forestry community because most of our parcels, more like almost 60% of our woodland owners in Ohio own 50 acres or less of woodlands. 100 acre woods is considered a large acreage. So a 600-acre tract of unfragmented woodlands is huge. It's very unique, and it should be looked at that way, is that it's a unique opportunity across the state because there's just not that many parcels like that left. They were talking about there's some of the proposed areas that were in the framework plan. They looked at some things about trying to concentrate some things, recreation fields and student housing. We'll look at some of those maps. Installing boardwalks around the vernal pools so that folks could enjoy them, but not have a negative impact on them. So there's some really unique resources out there, but they need to be able to get in and enjoy it without having a negative impact to the vernal pool. One thing they also looked at were soil conditions, and so here are some of those based on the soils that they found. You need to pay attention to these limited soils and the construction that you're looking at doing. Same way with the trail site. Depending on what kind of trails you're looking at, it could be hard to maintain them if they're not put in the right locations and on the right soil conditions. Oops, let's go back here. So the multi-purpose trail that was being proposed, most of them found it sat on what they called very limited soil, and so it would require a lot of extra installation and maintenance. It's something that you need to think about if that's the route you're going to go, and make certain that you are aware of those extras. And then we talked about creating some demonstration areas. It was interesting as the students. There's two other demonstration forests in Ohio. One that's much more active than the other, the Vinton State Forest. Vinton County in southern Ohio has had more than 50 years of research done, demonstration plots for woodland owners. So woodland owners can go and look and see different cutting practices, different treatments. There are some similar plots at Mohican, but they've only been put in and not maintained as well. So the discussion was, can we not create something here that woodland owners could come in and learn about practices and how to apply them properly and then go back and be better stewards for their woodland acres. This was one of the maps that they were using that was in the framework plan, and you'll see here's the geodetic site for the laser. There's a vernal pool up in here where this new roadway has been proposed, and so those are things that need to be taken into consideration. This housing area that was proposed, the vernal pool sits right there. And so that was one area that the students were very concerned about, having something so close, both of these sites so close to such a high value. And then these were just some of their thoughts on housing and the recreation fields and where to locate some things as they work through. And realize that this map is kind of a compilation of 6 different groups' ideas that I tried to put on one map and capture kind of what some of them were looking at. So the students themselves, this was very unique for them in the past few years, and I don't know how long it goes back. They pretty much had been doing their field work in the Mohican State Forest, drive up from Columbus, collect data, drive back to Columbus. Next day, drive up from Columbus, collect data, and head back. And so in this case, they stayed here in the campus housing, and so it's the first time they've done that for quite a while. So part of what Dr. Gates asked is we want to know feedback from the students. How did this work? How do you feel it worked and how well did it go over with them? So you can kind of see very important or essential. And most of the students that I talked to said being able to bond in the evenings, work together as teammates, instead of going back to Columbus and everybody going home to their own place, made this experience a much more worthwhile experience than what they had heard about in the past. The hands-on component, as I said, Marne and I spent a couple of days up here with them, walked through the woods a couple of times, and being able to work around campus, hands-on things, talk to the administrators that are here and get a sense for what we're looking at and what we're looking for from them as resource managers, basically, at that point. So putting all those skills together that they've been learning over the last 4 years and trying to pull it all together. So you can kind of see, gave us a chance to experience a real survey and management plan, concentrate, travel takes too much time. Obviously, some of them were very good at mushroom hunting. I will tell you that he told the story when they did their project report was that he sent one of the girls to Myers to get butter to be able to saute the mushrooms, and they came back with, I can't believe it's not butter. Oh. They were not happy with that, but they still enjoyed the mushrooms. So this is some of the trees that are sitting behind the Child Development Center. So some very large trees, part of that, what they were calling more old growth, part of the legacy forest. You can kind of see, here they are in the stream, but the team and that bonding experience. And I think that I have sat in on their reports for probably the last 5 or 6 years and given them feedback when they do kind of their report to the public. It was very obvious in the reports when they did them this time that they were much more heavily involved and much more invested in what they were saying and what they were proposing when they put their management plans together. They did cook out. One of the faculty, Bob Gates, said to me, we had some gourmet chefs and the students that they were grilling out, and they were grilling out at all hours of the night. So I don't know what all they were grilling, but apparently they did have a good time. And sometimes it was just too much. So I had a couple of them say that they were really glad that they felt like it pulled everything together and it just made everything make sense when they were here. So part of what we've been doing, and that's kind of the end of the management plan part, but part of that has grown out into this article that was in on campus, was repeated in the Alumni magazine here just recently, about what we're looking at here. And I've actually had some inquiries from other places now that once they've seen these articles and want to know what we're doing here and how can we incorporate with some things that they're doing elsewhere. So this article that Christina did on the on-campus thing has kind of spurred some more growth. And just so you understand where I come from in this, my part in all of this is I am our program director in forestry. And so I oversee our private woodland owner education program on the extension side in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. So my big role is to put classes together that reach out to our woodland owners and make them better stewards for the land. And what we did here, we offered some classes here this year. This is our website, and I don't think, these are some of them from recent days, but you can kind of see this is what we ended up offering here on campus this year through our Woodland Stewards program. A lot of our landowners were very impressed with the facilities and being able to walk outside the classroom and do hands-on stuff. So it has worked fairly well. We started out early in the spring and didn't quite have all the marketing pieces that we needed together. That's probably still that area that we need to get folks used to this being maybe a hub for us for woodland owner education. What you guys see as we headed towards the summer, and this was in early August, we had 28 teachers here for a 2-day youth scientist teachers workshop for some new curriculum. So from my perspective of what the students have provided us, they've given me some ideas of what we can put in place. What kind of demonstrations could we do and help landowners understand that if they've got something like this on their property, then what can they do with it? We do have to work on our marketing. We are looking at hosting Tree School here probably in April of 2014. We have a meeting coming up where we will probably work on a whole list of classes that will be here. We had a meeting yesterday, and our Ohio Forestry Association wants to work with us to put chainsaw safety classes here on a regular basis. So that's already one thing that has come out of just a recent meeting. They liked the facility when they taught one here for the workers and said, you know what, this works very well for us in Northern Ohio. Can we make this a more regimented aspect? So that's been one growth already. So questions? That's a lot of information. And there's a lot of stuff there that we could probably dig through. If you've got questions on the coursework, there are some folks here that could probably help us with that because I'm not as familiar with that side of things. Yes?
Do they know how illegal this is?
I don't think they do. And I need to figure out where that is because it's outside of Lexington and I haven't quite, I need to go in and see if I can figure out where it is and then we can get more information on it. No, it's not on this property. It sits outside of Lexington somewhere. I would say, if I have to assume, I'd probably assume around Clear Fork.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
Will that class be held here next year as well? This summer class?
The same class that did this during the Maymester will be back for this coming May, and they will pick up kind of this new class will pick up where this one sort of left off. So as I said, this kind of sets us a foundation. There's still more data that needs to be collected, and you don't collect everything you need in just a few days. And so there's more data collection, and probably what will come out of our intent, at least, to come out of this next class is a much more detailed and focused management plan. This is very broad-based, just to give us an idea of what's here and kind of what our options are. So the next one should have more detail to it, hopefully. Yes?
When I was driving in today, I saw construction of some housing already. Did that appear on the map? I couldn't quite figure out.
No, that was not part of that original map. That has changed since we did this process.
But I can add to that, if you go on the website, it is shown on the framework plan that growth that is not on campus, that is private housing off campus. It is shown on the framework plan where all of these pressure points are, or opportunity points are. Obviously, this looks at the woodlands. The framework looks at everything from recreation to outreach to the community. How do our students get from here down to the commercial area? All those kind of things are in the framework plan. So it's broader, which is my question to you, and part of what we're here with our partners in the community today is what opportunities along the woodlands and natural resources are there between us and our community partners. Pat and I talk a lot about people in the community. We have a lot of great resources here. Mohegan and Malabar, and it goes on and on and on. How do we fit into that group of individuals? What opportunities exist?
I mean, one of the things I said when Brian and I discussed earlier was, I grew up in Mansfield. I knew the campus was here. I didn't know there were 600 acres of woodland sitting out here. I was one of those that went straight down to Columbus. I could have done, I think, 1 quarter here, and then I would have had to transfer down, and it was like, if I'm gonna just do 1 quarter, I'm gonna go to Columbus. And so I ended up not going here, but was here for events during high school and that, and just never realized the resources that were here. So you really do have some valuable things that I think, how do we connect those with the community and how do we make folks make use of what is here as well?
One of the things I would suggest too is we have a lot of different functions out here. In fact, I was approached yesterday from our first energy friends over there, and they have a transmission line that goes right through the middle of our campus. What was suggested is they need to do research on managing woodlands and species under their power lines. What a great platform for them to come out and study under their power line on our campus.
One of
it's
the
amazing,
things,
I wouldn't have thought of that.
Right. And one of the things I will add is I just did an invasive species talk for the utility arborist here during Farm Science Review Week, actually. And the discussion was, how these invasive species impact negatively soil conditions and other habitat issues. And I had several of the utility arborists say to me, I didn't realize how bad they were. How many we have sitting under our power lines? We need to deal with this. And so it was an interesting conversation that, an offshoot of being asked to do a general invasive species discussion kind of morphed into, how do we better connect and make those decisions management-wise. And you're right, here, Multipurpose Rose loves those power lines. Other questions? Yes?
Last week, before the rains, I walked to two of those vernal pools, the larger ones, and they were all dry. So it becomes difficult to identify the extent so how do we do this when it's dry? Any suggestion?
I'm probably not the best one to ask that question of. I'm certain we've got some folks on faculty that have a much better understanding of the vernal pool. Marne would be one of those, and I would assume some of our other faculty that could help delineate those areas. There's definitely vegetation changes. So you're right, they're wet through the spring, and sometimes, and I know the larger one had water in it when we were here in early August, but that was because of July was so wet, it did have water in it. But what we'd have to look at, I know one of those things is you need to look at where the vegetation changes. Some of those tree species would not be existing in inundated water, so they don't like to have their feet wet. So if you've got something that likes to grow on drier sites, growing there, you know that the water doesn't sit there very long if it sits there at all. So you have to look at some of those kinds of things in order to make those delineations without water being in them. But we could do that. Let's do it. Other questions?
Speaking of water, you mentioned the headwaters there.
You are, and that's probably one of the unique issues with the streams that you have, is that a good portion of the streams, you are sitting in the headwaters of those stream breaches. And so what goes on here sets the tone for everything downstream. The phrase is we all live downstream. Well, in this case, there's a lot of folks that live downstream of what goes on this campus. So those are critical areas that need to be realized that they're here and protected as much as possible. So yeah.
And they go both directions.
And they go both directions. Yes.
Invasive species, I just wondered if there are any existing woodlands that you talked about and they can take over in those areas. How do you go about managing all that? Weed it or what?
Well, interesting enough, the whole invasive species section, when the students did their reports, most of them said it's economically not feasible to deal with the invasive species. And there's several of us that were sitting in the audience going, not a good thought process. Because the reality is if we don't deal with them, the whole habitat structure changes. And we've seen that in a lot of places. And so the fact that in the older woodlands that they're not invading yet underneath, except for things like garlic mustard, is a good thing. Because that means it's still at a manageable point. When you get into that younger growth stand, the barberry and the multiflora rose, that is in there because the canopy is somewhat open. So you either you set up some type of program where you're either going to pull them, cut them. If you're going to cut them, then you're going to have to treat. And so there has to be, it becomes now part of the management of the landscape. And even things like viburnum leaf beetle. So you've got this invasive insect now that could kill the majority of the native viburnums in the woods. And it's outside of Oglewood Hall, right there between Bromfield and Oglewood is where we found it. And so even in the landscape, now if you've planted viburnums anywhere around the buildings, here's another consideration you have to take into what you're going to lose those viburnums unless you treat or deal with them or replace them. And so it becomes part of the management scheme. And these students, Dan Yossi was retired, he's retired from the U.S. Forest Service, and he was one of the instructors, and he and I both said to this group of students, you are facing challenges that when we came out of college with our bachelor's degree and went to be a land manager, we didn't have to think about it. But these are game changers, and these are things that we have to think about, and so it has to be part of that thought process. that if we don't do something, these are the consequences. If you're going to live with the consequences, I'm one of those that you have to understand the pros and cons, and as long as you understand that, for private woodland owners, they make those decisions. For the university, we actually have that piece of equipment you saw there. We also have one on Waterman, and we are in the process in both locations of pulling honeysuckle, pulling autumn olive, pulling out multiflora rose, buckthorn, to try to get a grasp of what's going on. One of the things that Molly Karen, a lot of us teach there for Farm Science Review, talking about the bad things of invasive species, and I said, but we're surrounded with them, and we're not doing anything about it. So we have started, and it has to be part of the management plan. And we try to do it as best as possible with as least amount of impact. There are some folks that don't like that tool, because you are doing quite a bit of disturbance to pull. But if you're dealing with large acres, that's more efficient and time-consuming, shrinks, and it's a lot simpler than to go back and maybe spot treat where things sprout back up instead of having to treat, hundreds of acres of large canopied plant.
What does spot treat mean? Is that
Spot treat
stuff?
would be like an herbicide, and so instead of coming in and facing, a wall of honeysuckle that you're trying to maybe spray foliage, in this case where you have little sprouts, you could just come in and treat those sprouts. A lot less chemical, a lot less impact, maybe a little more time consuming because you're coming back once to remove and once, to go back in and treat. But I think end result is a little more successful than trying to do it in a broad way. Yes?
No programs to bring any kind of fishes, mantids, or ladybugs?
Very have the ladybugs. No, there wasn't anything, we haven't talked about anything along those lines. The ladybugs are here, viburnum leaf beetle is here, emerald ash borer is here, they're doing their damage, and we will have to deal with those accordingly. We hope that we don't get hemlock woolly adelta, because you do have some planted hemlock around. We will hope that you don't get Asian longhorn beetle, because the sugar and red maple will be history if we don't stop that from coming here as well. Thousand canker disease of walnut. We could go on. So no, let's work with what we have and hopefully keep the others at bay. Other questions? Guys, want to add anything? Any of you, all four of you that are sitting there.
I would add, this is going to be on the website. This will be up on the OSU Mansfield website shortly. In addition to, as I mentioned earlier, the framework plan describes what we hope will be the next 50 years on this campus. So if you want to go there, you can start to get a sense of all the issues that come to managing 640 acres. I think the biggest shift that I've seen here in the last few years is we're looking outwards and we're reaching out to the community, and those connections bring with it not only opportunities, but the challenges of managing those things as they come here. We're working very closely with Ontario City, Mansfield, regional planning. We are part of the whole plan here on the north end.
And then what I would add is, again, from the academic side, we have folks who are here from the Worcester campus. We've had previous discussions in which we've talked about an environmental studies program that would unite our ability to look at forest and stream work with what Worcester campus can do, ATI and OERDC around farmland, but also reaching out to Ohio State Marion because they have prairie land and building an environmental studies program that would have that kind of diversity. So students might get all or some of that depending on what their interests are. We have some ongoing discussions with our faculty members about that. We are building out our own next sets of hires, especially in our biology program, to be paying attention to the environmental studies component of this. But we will be having future forums on campus that will allow us to hear from students, hear from present faculty, and also community stakeholders about what this kind of programming could do for folks. We have had some conversations with the Columbus campus, and actually when President Maluta was recently here, he heard a little bit about the environmental studies said he very much could see the reverse flow on 71 happening, where instead of only students leaving Mansfield to go to Columbus, it would be the reverse for students who would be interested in studying forests and streams. They might start on the Columbus campus and end on the Mansfield campus. And when that coincides with the off-campus student housing that's being built, we may have capacity in the next several years for up to 500 new beds. That's going to represent a tremendous opportunity for us to see that kind of advancement of programming. Because as more students come here, in the short run, that will be an environment, that will be an economic uptick for us because it'll just simply create increased enrollment. But over time, what we know historically from around the country is you can't just add housing. If you don't add programming that goes with it, and especially programming that keeps students for longer periods of time, eventually that housing will decline. So we know that we need to increase the programming, and we see environmental studies as a natural way to increase that. Along those same lines, and the hint about whatever will be called Earth Lab, Terrestrial Lab, we are very serious about that. And after a number of other individuals who could not be here today get to actually view this presentation, as well as our sending out the slides. And by the way, the copies of the slides will also be made available on the website. We will be gathering up a group of stakeholders to talk about next steps with regards to that as well. You can look for that to happen on or about early 2014. So that'll be the next step that we will be taking in terms of bringing, we hope to be a broad-based coalition of interested stakeholders to take that conversation to the next step as well. And then in the meantime, I think the other thing that we'll begin to see is more and more promotion of extension-based activities, not only on their website, but on our website, so that more and more people understand the kind of direct programming that we're already going to be doing in front of all of these other things that will come later on down the road.
Very good. Anything else?